We're in a study of Daniel, the book of Daniel. We're in part 19, and I'm only in chapter 4, but we're ending chapter 4 tonight, so we're making progress. So we're going to read verses 34 through 37. Daniel, chapter 4, verses 34 through 37. Again, excuse the way my voice sounds. I really am over that sickness, but going to sound like this for a little bit yet, I think. It says, at the end of the days, I, Nebuchadnezzar, so this is King Nebuchadnezzar talking, lifted my eyes to heaven, and my reason returned to me, and I blessed the Most High and praised and honored him who lives forever. For his dominion is an everlasting dominion, and his kingdom endures from generation to generation. All the inhabitants of the earth are accounted as nothing, and he does according to his will among the host of heaven and among the inhabitants of the earth, and none can stay his hand. In other words, nobody can prevent him from doing something or say to him, what have you done? At the same time, my reason returned to me, and for the glory of my kingdom, my majesty and splendor returned to me. My counselors and my lords sought me, and I was established in my kingdom, and still more greatness was added to me. Now I, Nebuchadnezzar, praise and extol and honor the King of heaven, for all his works are right, and his ways are just, and those who walk in pride he is able to humble. So we spent quite a bit of time now in chapter 4, and this vision that Nebuchadnezzar has, and how Daniel or the dream that he had, and Daniel interpreted it for him, and then Nebuchadnezzar basically turns into like an animal for 7 years, and everything that we've seen so far, including this time of judgment, which we looked at last week, none of that should have been unexpected. None of that should have caught Nebuchadnezzar by surprise, because Daniel had clearly told him, this is going to happen to you because you've been arrogant and you've refused to repent of your sin. That goes back to verse 24 and 25. This is Daniel. It says, this is the interpretation, O king. It is a decree of the Most High, which has come upon my lord the king, that you shall be driven from among men, and your dwelling shall be with the beasts of the field. You shall be made to eat grass like an ox, and you shall be wet with the dew of heaven. Now, if it just stopped there, right, it would seem to go on forever. But thankfully, God was merciful to Nebuchadnezzar, and he says it's not going to last forever. So that's the rest of verse 25. So here's what's going to happen to you. It says, and 7 periods of time shall pass over you, till you know that the Most High rules the kingdom of men and gives it to whom he will. So Nebuchadnezzar had been vain and arrogant, and he had to learn. He had to humble himself. And so there's this glimmer of hope. He spends these 7 periods of time, which again I believe to be years, and he suffered greatly because of his pride, but eventually he knew that his suffering and his humiliation would come to an end. Now, what's interesting, by the time you get to verse 34, it talks about his reason returning to him. I was kind of wondering, how quick did that happen? And the Bible doesn't actually say. It just says it happened. And so it could have been, instantly. It could have been hours, days, weeks. We don't know. But the point is not so much how quickly it happened. The point is the reason it happened. Why did his thinking become clear again? And it's because he finally humbled himself before the Lord. That's verse 34. At the end of the days, in other words, the time of judgment, when he's like an animal, I, Nebuchadnezzar, lifted my eyes to heaven. My reason returned to me. And what does he do? I blessed the Most High, and I praised and honored him who lives forever. And so, essentially, if you want to boil this part of Daniel chapter 4 down to one lesson, you could say, this is a perfect illustration of the danger of pride, because that's why he was judged. And finally, he came to the place where he realized how insignificant he was, even though he's king of the greatest nation in the earth, right? He realized how insignificant he was compared to God. And when that became clear, the judgment was removed. And so, essentially what you see in Nebuchadnezzar is this 180-degree shift. He was this person, and he became someone totally different. His attitude changed. Let me show you the difference here. Let's compare. Let's start with verses 29 and 30. This is who he had been. At the end of 12 months, he was walking on the roof of the royal palace of Babylon. And the king answered and said, this is so arrogant. Is this not this great Babylon? Now watch this. Which I have built by my mighty power as a royal residence and for the glory of my majesty. That's who he had been. Look at me, look what I've done. And now that his reason is returning, he sees things differently. Look at verse 34. At the end of the days, I, Nebuchadnezzar, lifted my eyes to heaven, and my reason returned to me. And again, we just read it a minute ago. I blessed the Most High, and I praised and honored him who lives forever. Before he had honored himself, right? And now he's giving honor to God. So again, essentially, he's done this 180-degree reversal. Back in verse 30, he's praising himself, he's honoring himself, and now you get to verse 34, he's praising God and honoring God. And so he starts with this kind of self-worship thing. Look at what I've done. But now he's lifting his eyes to heaven. He's saying there's one far greater than me, and God is the one who was always in control. Now, I think Nebuchadnezzar, none of us are ever going to be the king of Babylon. We're never going to have that kind of power and authority, right? We know that. And so, in many ways, his life is very different than ours is. But there's one way that Nebuchadnezzar's life is just like every sinner, including us, right? Sin causes you to lose the right perspective. Sin makes you believe you're at the center of everything. And so instead of keeping your focus on God and realizing he's the purpose of everything, you start thinking, hey, it's all about me. So in that sense, we're not that different than Nebuchadnezzar, because we all fall into that trap. And without Jesus, we stay caught in that trap. And so Nebuchadnezzar, his mind is now different. He sees God as being everything. And so his heart is right, his mind is right, and what happens? God restores the kingdom. That's verse 36. At the same time, my reason returned for me, and for the glory of my kingdom, my majesty and splendor returned to me. My counselors and my lords sought me, and I was established in my kingdom, and still more greatness was added to me. In other words, even what he had before, as powerful as he had been, God made him even greater. Now you read verse 36 and you think, he still sounds a little bit self-centered, right? But keep reading, go to verse 37. So now he says, I, Nebuchadnezzar, what does he do? I praise and extol and honor the King of heaven, for all his works are right and his ways are just. And he's learned firsthand, those who walk in pride, he's able to humble. I was thinking about something, and I want to suggest this to you, and it might come up. You might have some thoughts about this in discussion time. And it's the definition of sin. I grew up, you've heard me say something like this before. I grew up in church thinking that sin was a list of forbidden behaviors, right? Here's these lists of bad things you shouldn't do, and as long as you don't do those things, you're okay, right? Don't drink, don't smoke, don't carry on, all that stuff, right? But the way I've come to see it now, and you don't have to agree with me, if you don't agree with me, we'll talk about it. I'd like to hear you. But the way I see it now, sin isn't just a list of behaviors. Sin is a mindset. It's a way of thinking that says, I can make my own life choices better than God can make them for me. You see? And so in that sense, I think the behaviors that we call sin, all the bad things, are the end result of the mindset. But the problem isn't just the behaviors. The deeper problem is the mindset. It's me saying, I can live my own life. I can make my own decisions. I don't need God telling me what to do. And so this is what had to change in Nebuchadnezzar. the mindset that said, I did this. I created this. I'm the one who accomplished this. And finally, when his reason returns to him, it's because he's realized what's most important. He's realized it's not him. He hadn't really done anything, that God was the one who'd been in control. And if Nebuchadnezzar had done anything good, it was because God had allowed him to do it. And God had a purpose. God had a reason. And that's what verse 37 is about. Again, I, Nebuchadnezzar, praise and extol and honor the King of heaven, for all his works are right, all his ways are just, and those who walk in pride he's able to humble. So I want to, as we wrap it up here, I want to walk through just some of the stages here in this confession that Nebuchadnezzar makes, because there are some specific things he says which I think are helpful excuse me, when it comes to really what it means to humble ourselves before the Lord. So the first thing he does, he puts it out there, his new belief that God is the one in control. That's the end of verse 34. For his dominion, God's dominion, is an everlasting dominion, and his kingdom endures from generation to generation. And then the end of verse 35. He does according to his will among the host of heaven and among the inhabitants of the earth, and none can stay his hand or say to him, what have you done? So again, we touched on this already, but I think if you want to have a healthy approach to life, if you want to be blessed, you can't put yourself at the center. If I'm at the center of my life, and if it's all about me, guess what? I'm going to get frustrated because I'm not capable. I'm not smart enough. I'm not strong enough. My ideas aren't good enough. And so I need to say, God's the one in control. God's the one who knows what he's doing. And actually, if I give control to God, it actually gives me a feeling of peace. That doesn't make sense to most people, right? Most people are afraid to give up control. Well, what'll I do? Well, you should realize you're going to mess your life up anyway, right? God is the only one you can trust with control. You're going to mess it up. Ask me how I know, right? God is the only one you can trust. And so it's good to know, it gives us a sense of peace and assurance to know that somebody greater than us, wiser, more loving, more powerful, that's the person calling the shots. And that leads then to a second thing. Number one, he recognized God's in control. Number two, he recognized his own limitations. That's in the beginning of verse 35. He says, all the inhabitants of the earth are accounted as nothing. Now, what he means there, if you look it up in Hebrew, it's a way of expressing the idea that God doesn't ask people's permission before he does something. He could if he wanted to, but he doesn't. Our voice doesn't come into it. God doesn't come to me and say, hey, Gary, are you okay if I do this? Is this going to work for you? God doesn't do that. Why? Because I'm inconsistent. I'm selfish. I have a history of making bad decisions. And I see myself as wise. I see myself as strong. But the truth is, only God sees things from an eternal perspective. So that's why he says, the inhabitants of the earth are accounted as nothing. In fact, go back to verse 34. His dominion is an everlasting dominion. His kingdom endures from generation to generation. The inhabitants of the earth are accounted as nothing. In other words, God doesn't, again, come to me seeking my counsel. Instead, he does according to his will among the host of heaven and among the inhabitants of the earth, and no one can stay his hand or say to him, what have you done? So there's two things, right, we've seen so far. Number one, Nebuchadnezzar admits God is the only one who's able to be in control and to do things right. Number two, he admits that human beings, including himself, are weak, sinful, and so God doesn't come asking us. He counts our opinion as irrelevant because he knows what's right and we don't. And then that leads to the third part of Nebuchadnezzar's confession. He confesses this idea. If God does something, it's the best thing. If God acts in a certain way, it's always the best decision. That's verse 37. I, Nebuchadnezzar, praise and extol and honor the King of heaven. Why? For all his works are right and his ways are just. That's hard for us to deal with sometimes. I've asked the why question many times. Why did God allow this? Why did God do this? We've all asked that question, right? Or we've been around people who are asking that question. Well, it's not fair. How could God do this? But listen, the reason God lets us go through stuff is because it's necessary. He sees things we don't see. Now, Nebuchadnezzar, for example, if he'd had the choice, he never would have signed up for 7 years living in the fields like an animal, right? Nobody would. But once it was over and he was restored, he looked back and he saw things with a fresh perspective, and he realized, yes, it had been hard. I'm sure he didn't deny the suffering he went through, but he understood everything that God had done was for his own good. And those are the three things that help us to remember when we're struggling, we don't know what's going to happen, or something bad is happening and we don't know why. Remember these 3 points. Number one, God is in control. Number two, I shouldn't be in control because I mess it up. And number three, God needs to be in control because he's the only one who knows what's best.